Okay, hopefully you're ready to build your first endpoint. Now, before I even start touching this controller, the first thing I want to do is just to find out the roots. Now, obviously your roots will be kept maybe in a separate file. For now, this is getting a little bit messy, but we can go ahead and down here define out our root group for our user's endpoint. Now, as part of REST and RESTful conventions, we need to be really careful about how we name our URLs. Now, I am a massive believer in not worrying too much about this, as long as it's well documented and it makes sense to anyone using your API. Really do what you want. But however, the main important thing is that we have always /users and then whatever we want to do. So if we were getting a list of users, we would make a get request to users. If we were getting a single user, we would make a request to users / and then the ID. If we were posting a user, we would post to users. If we were updating a particular user, we would either do a put or a patch on users and then the user that we wanted to update. And if we wanted to delete a user, we would do the following. So delete users1. Now, you can get into slightly more complex URI patterns. So for example, let's say you had a forum. Well, let's say you wanted to get a particular post from a particular topic. You may do something like topics1 and then posts 5. So this would be, say, the first topic, and then this would be the 5th post, and so on and so forth. And you could do the same for patching that maybe. If you wanted to patch the first topic, you could do that. If you wanted to patch the 5th post in the first topic, you would do that. So what we're going to be doing is just focusing on one level, but after this, using root grouping, you'll be able to go in and do a little bit more with this. So the first thing I want to do is define out a root group. Rather than make these all individual, I want to explicitly say, I want this group to start with users. Then in here, I have my closure. And then in here, I can register each individual one pointing to the controller. So for the first one then, this is just a list of the users. So let's go ahead and define this out. We're going to say this get. And because this is a get request just to /users, in here we just do an empty string. Now we can define out our controller and our method, and we can either do that directly in here with a string, or we can go ahead and import our user controller at the top, which would make a lot more sense. It makes it a little bit more readable. So we have our user controller in there, and we know that we can do user controller class and then append on the method name. In this case, it's going to be index. So that is our first RESTful endpoint, just to grab a list of users. Now we can go ahead and fill this in. So over in user controller, let's go ahead and create this index method. Remember, we have access to our database now because we have access to this C, and then from that we can use the database. So we can go ahead and fill this out. Now, before we do anything, we want to make sure we pull in our request, pull in our response, and pull in any arguments. Now, we don't need our argument or our request in this sense because we don't need to accept any data to store or anything like that. And we don't have any arguments because this is just the /users endpoint with a list of users. What we do need though is our response, really, really important, so we can actually respond with JSON, and this makes sense. So the first thing to do then is just construct a simple query. Now, like I said before, this is going to be very rough. When we get to things like updating users, we're not going to be validating. So this really just pulls everything together, and then you can go on and later tidy it up depending on what logic you need. So we're going to access our container, we're going to access the database, and we're going to perform a query. This isn't a prepared statement because we don't have anything to inject in. So we're going to select everything from users. And if you had a created at date maybe on your database table, you could go ahead and do this in maybe descending order. For now though, we're just going to do this, and it will just be in the order that we created them, pretty much by the ID. So now immediately after this, we're going to say fetch all, and we're going to fetch these as an associative array. So we're just going to say fetch associative, and just because I'm using PDO and I'm not within a kind of empty namespace, so we have a namespace here, we need to explicitly use PDO at the top, or we will get an error. Now, to respond to this request, we've already seen that we can respond with something like a view, but in this case it's slightly different. We need to set headers, and then we need to write to the body using a JSON encoded version of what we have here. Now, if we just do a var dump on users and just take a look what we get, if we come over to Postman and start to construct this request, we'll see. So let's go over to localhost and over to Slim controllers users. So you're going to want to put the full path to wherever you're working in here. We're going to go ahead and make a GET request, and we're going to go ahead and send this off. And we should see that dumped. And it looks like we have controllers not found. That's because I extended controllers. You probably noticed that. Let's send the request through and we get an empty array. We expect that because we've got no data in our database table, but we'll go ahead and fill something in there in a minute. Okay, so before I do anything, I'm going to save this request out, and I'm going to save this as users index, and I'm going to save it into the users collection, just so we have it there when we need it later. Okay, so just so we can see this, let's create a couple of fake users in here. Let's just create one in here, and we'll just do 2 for now, just so we can see what's going on. So Dale at codecourse.com, and let's just fix that one up as well. Okay, so we should now have an array of 2 users. There we go. Now, obviously that's not good enough. We need JSON, and to do this, traditionally, you could do something like the following. Now, we need to return a response because we need to modify some things about this response. Now, what we could do is say with header, and this is the long way to do it, and there's nothing wrong with doing this. We choose the content type here, and the content type is application JSON. This just ensures that anyone using this gets the correct header type back, or the content type back in that header, and it knows that it's JSON. And then what we do is we write the users to the body. Now, this isn't going to work, and we'll take a look why in just a minute. If we just come over here and send this request, you can see here, if we come over to the preview tab, could not write to stream. Now, this doesn't give us much information, but the reason that this isn't working is we're trying to write an array to our body. Now, we know that we can't really do that within PHP. So what we need to do is JSON encode what we are actually sending through, like so. Now, this will work. So if we just pull this up in Postman, you can see that if we come over to the Pretty tab, we have now a list of our users. So that was pretty simple. However, having to write this long line again and again and again gets really annoying. Now, what I'm going to do is just divert and come over to our response object within Slim. So if you just open this up, again, you can find it in your vendor folder under Slim, and then Slim HTTP and response. Now in here, we have the methods that we've been looking at, like write. We have things like with status and all the things that we would normally expect. What we do have though is a method called with JSON. So what this will do is it will go ahead and automatically write to the body JSON encoding the data we pass in, and it will also respond with the correct content type as well. So this is a super helpful method that rather than having to do all of this on our own, all we actually need to do is say return response with JSON, passing in what we want, and that is it. That's all we need to do, and now we should get exactly the same result like so. And we can inspect the headers that we get back here just to make sure, and you can see the content type is application JSON. So that's pretty much the basics of grabbing something database, however you're going to do this, and then responding with that correct content type and with JSON encoded data. So now that we've done this, we're going to head over and create the show method, which is slightly more complicated because what we need to do is also check if a user doesn't exist and then set the status appropriately. So let's very quickly do this, and then we'll move on to some of the other methods that we're going to look at. Now, we know that to grab an individual user, we'll have a show method. Now, what I'm doing is giving these very specific names. It doesn't really matter what you call these, but as long as you're consistent throughout all of your RESTful controllers. So let's pull in our request. Let's pull in our response and our arg. Now, we do actually need our args because what we're going to be doing is passing through a user ID to this URI. So let's just head over to our routes, define out this particular route, and we'll see how this works. So this is going to be / and then the user ID, and that is it. We use a placeholder here that we can pass through. We already saw an example of that earlier, and we call the show method, and that is all we need to do. So if we just come over, make the request, and then we'll fill it in. All I'm going to do is duplicate this request down, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make sure that's saved. And I'm going to edit this to users, and we'll just call this show. Okay, so this is going to be users /1 or whatever, and we're going to make a get request to this as well. So let's send this over, and we can see we get nothing. It's not errored. We have our controller method set up. We just need to do something in here. Now, the first thing we need to do is get the user by their ID. We then need to check if they do not exist, so if that particular record can't be found, and then otherwise return JSON. So this seems pretty simple, but what I'm actually going to do is extract out the getting of the user by their ID to a separate method. And like I said, this is the beauty of using a controller. You have the flexibility to implement other methods elsewhere. So let's create a protected method, because we don't need to access this outside of the controller. Get user by ID, and of course into this method we pass in a user ID. Now this is going to create a prepared statement because we're passing through an ID into a query. We want to make sure that things are nice and secure. We're going to check if we have a count and return null otherwise, and otherwise we're going to grab that user. So the first thing we're going to do is create that statement, and again we can still access this container, still access our DB, and this time we're going to prepare a statement, and in here we want to select everything from the users table, or select all columns, but this time where the ID equals an ID that we give, and we just use a placeholder in there and we bind it in later. Now we just need to execute this statement like so, passing in that ID, so we can pass in the ID that we're providing there, and then we can just go ahead and check if there are no users. To do this, we use the statement and we use a row count method. We check if that equals 0, and if it does, we just want to return null because we can't find a user by that ID. And then we return the statement, we use the fetch method, and we're going to again fetch this as an associative array. So we prepare our statement, we execute it using the ID that we're going to pass into this method. If there are no users, we return null, otherwise we return the user. So here then, we need to basically grab, if we do args ID, this is the ID we're going to pass into this method. So if we just come over to Postman again, send this across, you can see we get 1 there. And of course, if we change this, that changes as well. So now that we have the ID, we have the method, we can go ahead and use this. So we're going to create a variable user, and we're going to say this get user by ID using that method that we've just created, grabbing the ID from the arguments in the URI, and then we can respond with JSON, but we're going to do a check in there in just a minute. So we're going to return a response with JSON with that user. So we've done this, we still need to do this here. So let's pop that in there just so we don't forget. So if we come over now, this is really simple. We now get a user ID of 1, 2, like so. But the problem is if we try and access a user that doesn't exist, we simply get null back. And we also get a 200 OK, which is not very good. We need the status code to reflect the state of the request that we've just made. And in this case, we need to check if the user exists here and return a 404 if they don't exist. We don't want to return any body. You can return errors in your body, but just as long as it's well documented and consistent. But to be honest, it's more than enough to just respond with a 404, and that will tell the client that this user can't be found. So we're going to say if user equals null, which remember we return from here, then we just want to return a response, and we don't need to respond with JSON, we just need to respond with a particular status code, and that is 404, and that is it. So if we come over now, send a request for user 3, we get a 404 not found. There's no body, but that's absolutely fine. The client who's consuming this API will now know that it can't be found. Now, if we do the same for 1 or 2, we know that that works. So that is our index of users and showing a particular user by their ID very, very simply. What we're going to do next, though, is move on to storing a user, which is a little bit more complicated, but pretty much contains the same concepts. We are just going to cover, though, what happens if things go wrong when we're storing a user.